Freedom of Information Summit presented by the National Freedom of Information Coalition. And we are delighted you all managed to join us. This is the 31st annual FOI Summit, and on behalf of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, we thank you all for your participation and joining us in this virtual environment. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, which is an action research center based here in New York. We are part of New York University, and we are looking into how can we change the way we make decisions using new science, new technologies, with a particular interest in opening governance. And I will be the moderator of this session, which is focused on creating a culture of compliance to open government laws. And what we hope to do in the next few minutes is to really try to take a 360-degree view of what's the current state of compliance, and especially how do we create a culture of openness within the local and state government context. Also trying to understand what has happened during a time of pandemic. Have we really seen this culture of openness perform well? How do we actually not only develop compliance, but also change the culture? And then also what we're gonna focus on is how do we manage disputes when compliance is at stake? And do the disputes also tell us a little bit about actually some of the challenges with some of the freedom of information laws that we might have as such. In order to address all of those issues in an hour, we have a tremendous panel from all over the elements of freedom of information. We have Amanda Castle from Fairfax County. We have Colleen Murphy from Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. And we have Chip Stewart from Texas Christian University. But without me giving a long-winded introduction of these, I will ask every panelist to briefly introduce themselves, also indicate the connection with, of course, the topic area. And after that, we can really chime in and go straight into the meat of the topics that we hope to address. Let's start with Amanda. Amanda, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I should start by saying that I have never been on a podcast, but I think that's what this has turned into. I'm pretty excited.
Right, yes, exactly.
So I just want to say a brief thank you to Dan Beverly for giving me the opportunity to participate on the panel. And I also want to give a quick shout out to the Executive Director of the Virginia Coalition of Open Government, Megan Rhyme, for her partnership and recommendations on promoting open government in Virginia, which is where Fairfax County is. It's so far been great to hear the perspectives and other sides perspectives that people have offered here in the sessions prior to this. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm currently the countywide FOIA officer for Fairfax County government. As I mentioned, Fairfax County is in Northern Virginia. We have a diverse population of about 1.2 million. We have about 50 agencies in Fairfax County. I previously worked for about 11 years in the legal industry as a paralegal with a focus on e-discovery and legal technology. I really think I've kind of made a career out of finding the balance between transparency and privacy and security. And really the two ways I've done that most effectively is through promoting new technology and also change management, both in the private sector and in the public sector now in Fairfax County. I think I was invited to this panel, and again, I'm very excited to be here and talk with my Colin Murphy and Daxton Chip Stewart. But I think I was invited here because I am the FOIA officer, which is not based in the attorney's office in Fairfax County. It's not based in our county executive's office. It's in the Office of Public Affairs. I don't see a lot of that throughout the country. We get about 11,000 FOIAs annually. I've developed a standardized countywide process and policy for the county. We've built, implemented, and continue to enhance an internal FOIA request tracking application that's used by almost all 50 agencies, which is about 170 users. And then just lastly, training for both employees and other localities and the public has been one other way that we've done FOIA right in Fairfax County. And I think in the county, we've become more efficient, more compliant, and more transparent to both the benefit of county employees and also our FOIA requesters. So I'm excited to be here, and that's a little bit of background about me.
Great, thanks so much, Amanda. Colleen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Murphy. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Connecticut FOI Commission. And our commission administers and enforces the Connecticut FOI Act. And we're an independent oversight agency, so we're not connected to any particular administration or the Attorney General or the Secretary of State. We're independent, and we hear and decide freedom of information disputes. And I've been here for my professional career thus far, quite a long while. And I'm also a member of the board for the NFOIC, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here today. One little opening remark, since I've worked in this area, as I said, for many, many years, I thought I'd seen just about, every push and pull on open government, but then the pandemic came along, and we now have a whole new world that we're trying to strike a lot of balances. So I really look forward to sharing with all of you.
Great, Colleen, and I will touch upon or ask you to touch upon the new normal, as they say, in a second. And Chip, can you also briefly introduce yourself, and then we go straight into the substance of the conversation here.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Chip Stewart. I'm a professor of journalism at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. I've been here about 13 years now. A little bit of background. I was a journalist before I was a lawyer, before I was a professor. And I was a news editor and in between in there a bit too. My background in this area, I've been studying and researching, writing about freedom of information and dispute resolution systems since I was a grad student about 15 years ago. And that was studying under Charles Davis, now the dean at University of Georgia, but who was the former president of this organization of NFOIC. So I've been reviewing a lot of aspects about how we design systems to resolve disputes, some of this culture of compliance, what we can do, what might help with compliance, what might not when it comes to enforcement mechanisms. And hey, it looks like we got some video coming on. I'm going to pop up my video here. And hi, everyone.
It can only get better now.
Yes, right. I'm trying to remember where I was.
Are you still the same person?
Yeah. Yes, right. A lot of my research has been in this area over the last, like I said, 10 to 15 years. And obviously a lot has changed over that time. So I'm here to talk some about those systems and what might help make them work and what might hinder those things and that sort of stuff.
Great, thanks so much, Chip. And so, as you can see, we have a stellar panel here that can really look into the issues of culture of compliance. And let's start with Colleen. You already indicated that we have entered a new normal as a result of the pandemic, or at least that the pandemic has been another one of those natural experiments to see how actually open government laws are being complied with and what the real culture of openness is when a pandemic or when an emergency hits. So what have you seen? What are your observations? And also, what does it tell us really about the value of freedom of information?
Thanks again. I've been thinking about this a lot, and much of what I would say has been said by some panelists prior to me, but I think what's happened during the pandemic is that openness has kind of cut both ways. But I have to say overall, I think there's a bit of decline, although there are some positives. In terms of records, we at the Commission, we deal with records and meetings. I think it's obvious that access generally has been clearly delayed during this time period. And sometimes that, of course, is legitimate. Everyone's dealing with less staff resources, people working remotely, but sometimes not legitimate. And I'm gonna give a new label to something that I think we've all seen and call it the pandemic pretext, where you get responses such as, sorry, we can't provide access because the building is locked where the records are kept, or the office isn't open right now, so we can't respond, and you can't hold that against us. And things like the governor said we don't have to respond at all during the pandemic. So, sometimes that is legitimate, but I think there's certainly a bit of a concern that that is a pretext in many instances. So the pandemic pretext. And also, I think, as has been said before, that we're really going to head into an era of issues and cases surrounding COVID-related records, lack of disclosure of basic health information, and it'll be really interesting to see how those are handled in the long term. In the short term, I've seen some concerning things about withholding that type of information. Thinking about meetings in general, and the previous panel really got into this quite a bit, but the accessibility of public meetings in many ways has really increased access. Nobody has to travel anywhere. There's less of an intimidation factor, I think, because people don't have to go and see their public officials to see what they're up to. And you can even attend many meetings in one day if you were so inclined. But the decline, of course, as was said previously, there's lots of technology problems. We just had a minor one here, but those sorts of things are rampant, although we're learning, I think, to deal with them. And not everyone has equal access to technology, so that's a bit problematic. And second, although there's nothing really to measure, I think, on this point, I truly believe that something is lost in a participatory democracy by all of our Zooming, Skyping, WebExing, the loss of that face-to-face interaction and the ability to see and observe the person, the people who work for government, leads to a loss of something. I don't know what that is yet, but some kind of connectedness. Someone said when you don't actually get to look in the eye of the person who's deciding that your benefit's going to be denied or something similar to that, something I think is lost there. And I think we'll feel that if we don't think of ways to resolve that. And finally, you have less access to public officials. If this is the only way you're going to see them, there's no way to have a one-on-one conversation with them. I think this is particularly an issue in terms of legislative work that may be going on. If you don't have a prior connection to a legislator, you're really not going to be able to get in to see that legislator. So I think it's really a mixed bag. Like all good transparency issues, we'll need to find the appropriate balance for the future. And even though we have the technology going forward, do we want to continue in this way? And I think this little meme that I saw the other day might be appropriate here. It was a picture of a kid, and the caption over his head said, "This is a child realizing that there will never be a snow day again because everything can be done remotely." So obviously the kid's face was pretty downcast. So I think of that in terms of our meetings, even if we have the best technology, do we never want to have a snow day again? Do we never want to meet in person again? And those are all the things I think we're really going to have to deal with. So I hope that answered the first part of your question.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, and that's exactly what I was hoping we would get into, which is really what's the pros and cons of the current environment with regard to actually openness, because as you said, on the one hand, we do have we can zoom into meetings that otherwise would require us to actually physically getting there, but at the same time, there are some costs involved with regard to transparency and with regard to really this notion of deliberation that does require a different environment. Are there some practices, and then I want to go to to Amanda with regard to some of her experiences, especially on from a change management point of view. But Colleen, are there some things that you said, well, this was actually an interesting innovation that I've seen, someone that actually leveraged the constraints that we have in some kind of an innovative way, like here, anyway, so we see that, anyway, while groups gatherings are limited, we do see some of those groups gatherings and deliberations happening in parks, for instance, which obviously, again, is not the same, but have you seen some kind of innovations that you say, well, at least, anyway, they're trying an effort?
Yeah. I haven't seen any innovations like those that you're describing, but I do believe that most public officials want to figure out a way to make this work, and that we're all open to a better way of doing things and trying to figure out potentially a hybrid model to run things. I think in Connecticut there were some good measures that our governor issued an executive order early on saying that citizens' rights under the Freedom of Information Act would not be lost during the pandemic, which is a little bit of a flip on what some other states had done to say that, you don't have to comply during the pandemic. But I think here, this was a positive step because it essentially extended the statute of limitations for people to file complaints. Mm-hmm. And I think that was, in a way, somewhat innovative and very heartening. And it also extended our time, the commission here, to decide citizen disputes as opposed to losing jurisdiction over them and having people lose their rights.
Great, thanks, Colleen. And yes, anyone who has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And by the way, I do feel like the chat room is from my point of view, a better way to actually pose questions, because it's a maximum transparency so that everyone can see the questions that are being posed. So there is some progress here when it comes to using Zoom technology. But let's go to Amanda. Amanda, you mentioned also in your introduction that you typically approach those issues from a change management point of view, and clearly compliance is important, but ultimately if we really want to establish a culture of openness, we probably have to go the extra mile and really think about also what are the incentives, what are the what's the kind of practice that we want to and change that we want to nurture. And so tell us a little bit about Amanda, how you go about this in your position and within the Fairfax County.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. And I will try to weave in answers to some of these questions that have come in from Chris and Tom and Betsy here. So as I kind of squished into my intro on the early podcast here, the county has been very successful in FOIA. And in March of 2017, I became the FOIA officer. And there's 3 ways that I think I found success in change management for the better for FOIA for Fairfax County. And in summary, the first is people, the second is process, and the third is really accountability. And I think on that third one, Chris, hopefully I can answer at least my personal opinion on how we can encourage public officials some more accountability there. So the first one on the people side, so in local government, at least in Fairfax County, we've developed close relationships with our attorneys, close relationships with senior management, agency directors, as well as agency FOIA staff at every single agency across the county. So the benefits of that, just by way of example, and this kind of goes to Betsy's question, lawyers can determine laws that both exempt information and allow us to hold information. But I often pose the legal question as what laws exist that would allow us to release this information. So I think the benefits of having relationships with attorneys, not only can we better understand each other, but I think it's for the good in terms of transparency and open government. Also, partnerships, in addition, technology experts, we're seeing this wave of new electronically stored information. So knowing how to get to social media records, knowing how to get to database files, knowing how to aggregate reports and be able to provide that to the public. I think those partnerships have allowed us to not only understand more what records we have, but how to produce them when the public asks for it. So that's number one, how I think the people has had an impact and success in change management. Mm-hmm. Two is the process, at least on the inside, showing agencies that there's a cost benefit to implementing new change in the process, from efficiency to compliance to transparency. Another thing that recently happened, we suggest agencies grant fee waivers if a FOIA request is less than $50. It isn't always the case that we waive all FOIA fees under 50, but more often than not we do, because we conducted a cost benefit analysis that showed the effort made to assess the fee, to ultimately collect the fee, and then take the check to the bank and reconcile. It actually exceeds the cost that a FOIA requester would be paying. So that's a second thing that we've done, and that's implement new process. And then the third, to Betsy's question, to Chris's question up there, accountability. The easiest way, I think, to encourage a public official to make sure that they're not just doing lip service, as you say, to use your words. How did they respond to their FOIA requests? What records were proactively released? What information was withheld despite the fact that the exemptions were discretionary and not mandatory? I think asking those questions is really important to maintain some accountability in the county. And we have done that through our FOIA tracker. I mentioned in the intro, we've implemented a tracker which basically tracks FOIA requests countywide. And so I can see by logging into the tracker what FOIAs are pending, who is submitting the FOIA request, what information are they seeking, and on the accountability front, how are we responding? Are we, again, like I said, being proactive in those responses? What are the fees that we're assessing? Are we printing those records and mailing them, or are we sending an email electronically? There's benefits to accountability and having a tracker that allows for that data that we can touch and we can feel and we can hold people accountable. And also, just lastly, on holding agencies accountable, training, asking the right questions. Your FOIA officer in your locality, I know we have a lot of folks from coalitions here, they probably know the FOIA laws pretty well, but to Betsy's question, they may not be a HIPAA expert. They may not be a Federal Privacy Act expert. So asking the questions and having them in turn go and get the answers from their lawyers, from other people who might know that information, I think really improves accountability. So people, process, and accountability is the way I think that we've done that.
Great, thanks so much. And let's go to Chip. So of course, one aspect of compliance is dispute resolution, and also, by the way, one aspect of accountability, which goes back to Amanda's last point as well. And you've done extensive research on dispute resolution as it relates to freedom of information. And so what have you learned? What are the types of disputes that are most likely to occur? And also, even in the context of COVID-19, what do you expect the disputes will be of the new normal? And so over to you, Chip.
Sure. I'd like to start by answering at least one of these questions with at least
yes.
A thing, and then and come back to that. So on Betsy's questions about HIPAA, I'm pretty sure that HIPAA doesn't work that way, but I can tell you that one of the papers in the next session will specifically address that because I remember reviewing it. So I encourage you to stick around for the next section where it should be discussed in detail on one of the paper panels. If that's I don't know if that one's going to be discussed specifically, but there are people looking at that very question. And the research papers I read this year were fantastic. I strongly encourage you to stick around for the next session. So yeah, to Stefan's question here, I've been looking at this for a long time, and really, I'm a lawyer. So I was a journalist before I was a lawyer, and so I came to this wondering why we have so many FOI laws that look great on paper and then don't seem to work. That seem to still result in a lot of disputes and a lot of litigation, a lot of unhappy parties on all sides. And one of the ways, one of the things I looked at is, well, what systems are built in to manage the disputes that arise beyond litigation? Litigation is the obvious one. Everybody can go to litigation for things. But one of the things we know, this was a study I did several years ago, for example, is that every FOI law has some sort of enforcement mechanism, ranging from civil to criminal penalties and all sorts of, punishments that can be taken or fines that can be assessed or levied. These don't really work. The system, while they may be enforced on occasion, is very selective, very sporadic. A lot depends on who's in power. I think the study that Dave Quillier did last year did a great example of this, that unless you build in mandatory non-discretionary penalties into the laws themselves, they're really not going to be that effective at getting to their goal, and the goal is compliance, right? It's not really just punishment, it's trying to get people to comply with the law. So if the law itself isn't going to encourage compliance, what might? These dispute resolution programs of the type that Colleen is in, which, by the way, is kind of one of the most renowned, long-running, well-run and well-accepted dispute resolution models, the Connecticut FOI Commission, that these sorts of systems grew up to try to handle some of these problems through non-litigious ways, through negotiation, through mediation, through investigation, report writing, education, all of these different things that might help to solve these problems. And some places have done this really well. I think Connecticut's a very good example of that. So when I've set out to study these, I've tried to look at what makes these things work in their design, for example, so that people buy into them. And that's what a lot is like. People have to believe in it. People actually have to trust the commission that is going to be independent, impartial, credible, those sorts of things, so they will actually trust and want to go to it to resolve disputes. I think a lot of the things that Amanda mentioned are very helpful here. That one is that the people really do matter. It's kind of simple that I wrote a 200,000 word dissertation on this topic, and I could have summed it up in people matter. That would have been my 2-person conclusion. You need to have top down, so people at the top who really believe in FOI. This gets a bit to Chris's question, right? That are committed to it being a public good. And I think that one thing journalists can do is really press on that, not just in campaigns, but throughout. That this is something you pledge to do and stand by this as a public good. And where we've seen that is like when you have leadership changes in states or in programs that manage this. I can think of, for example, Florida, which had a very well-regarded mediation program in his AG's office when Charlie Crist was AG, and then later when Charlie Crist was governor. Those processes started to decline when the type of leadership didn't support that as much. So when you had people at the top who really believed in FOI and put people in the governor's office and in the attorney general's office to try to mediate these disputes so they wouldn't go to litigation, that really worked. And when you didn't, it didn't. We've seen that change here in Texas, where the attorney general, so Greg Abbott, who's now our governor, well, when he was attorney general, he was actually a pretty respectable advocate for open records and open meetings laws here. His successor, Ken Paxton, has not been as much. And so we see that change in just like the sort of letters they issue, the sorts of questions they're going to hear. But we know right now in Texas that if you're going to be making a request of the Texas Attorney General's office, they're not going to cut you a whole lot of slack and tend toward openness. That's just one change in person, and even though it wasn't even a change in party, but it changed very much how people are going to make and handle these types of requests here. And as a result, those are not exactly binding precedent, but they set up a lot of the policies for how things are going to be processed here. So yeah, so the people really do matter, and having people at the top who are going to commit to openness and be consistent about it, and then build processes that work with that are very helpful. When you're designing programs, no matter what kind of program you design, that I think it's key to involve stakeholders. This is just, of all my research, what it showed, and this is consistent with dispute systems design modeling in other dispute resolution contexts, that if you're going to build a system, whether it's through the Attorney General's office, whether it's an independent commission, whether it's an ombuds program or a public records advocacy board or whatever they might be, and there's many different models of this I can talk about more if people would like, that when you do that, you really need to have the stakeholders involved in the design, so that and to be involved in building that office, so they're going to have some trust and credibility whether they're from the government side, whether they're from the journalist side, the public advocate side, because you need to have all the stakeholders really believe that this can work. And have faith in that process, that the leadership of that is going to be independent and trying to seek goals that are like for the good of the people and not just for whoever the attorney general or governor or whatever might be. So those are important as well. Let's see. I guess the last one here, and this again, it's frustrating when you're a lawyer and you want to talk about the fix is not law. You know, I'm used to, you know, it's the hammer, and if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And you know, so much as we're learning right now in a lot of different contexts is in norms, is in upholding norms that may not be laws, or norms that may be built around the laws or in the shadows of those laws. And those norms can be things like Amanda mentioned, or I'm sorry, that Colleen mentioned, that a norm, for example, of not reflexively denying everything, or not having the, you know, the what you call it, the pandemic pretext, that we have a reason to deny, so we're going to deny. You know, and that's just a starting point. And your leadership can change that sort of stuff, but the attitude of we can deny, so we're going to deny, is not an attitude that's in favor of transparency or openness. So how do you get beyond that? Again, things Amanda mentioned: good training, good education. I think whatever model, whatever system you have that has a training and education element to it that upholds the value of openness is really important. Things that look for reasons to default to openness rather than closure, obviously, would be valuable in the advocacy context. And coming back to the pandemic, to the specific things we've talked about here, yeah, it's a real challenge. So I have my students do an open record project where they all have to file an open records request. We did that last spring. They turned in their open records request the week before, in early March, basically, so just before everything shut down. And so what initially looked like it was going to be, let's see, we were asking specifically, how do mayor's offices, how much do mayor's offices in big cities pay for security? That was the simple question. Give us a dollar figure over a year. And what it turned into as a project was, who kept their open records offices open in March and April? Because most people got denied, and the grounds they got denied on were various. Some were, those records are in our office and we can't get to them. Some of them were, the mayor, the governor, whatever the case might be, has designated this to be a non-essential function. And so since it's a non-essential function, we will not pursue it. That was pretty scary, right? That open records and transparency is a non-essential function of government. And some people actually complied, or said, well, we'll be able to comply when we can get back access to those records and that sort of thing. So yeah, so dealing with this in this context, what would have been better, obviously, is if we had some trust systems in advance and systems that existed to help facilitate online electronic disclosure, which involves online electronic record keeping, and systems to make those available, would have helped a lot of this stuff happen before. And as Colleen mentioned, maybe we're setting the groundwork for that sort of thing to happen from now on, that if there's never going to be snow days again, that means maybe no snow days for the government in keeping records and disclosing records, which is a net positive for transparency. All right, I'll cut off there and glad to answer.
No. This is great, Chip, and I do want to pick up on one of the elements you mentioned with regard to even the non-essential, or even also how do you go, how do you actually do this kind of norm setting as well? And so in the past I did some work in around information sharing within government, and I always made the bad joke is that I never met anyone who got promoted because they shared information, right? And so you have this hoarding behavior, but you could, anyway, what we tried to do was to actually change it by also changing the performance metrics, and saying is that actually if you, anyway, you actually will be rewarded if you start sharing more. And so that leads to what I've been trying to, anyway, consider more and more is this kind of, instead of naming and shaming, to actually do more naming and faming, that you actually would celebrate the ones that are sharing. And so have you seen this at all, Chip, in a way to actually promote behavior by actually rewarding sharing and being open, as opposed to anyway, constantly naming and shaming if not is being shared, and as a result, you might shift the norm that actually this is something something more aspirational as a burden. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way before, and it doesn't mean I haven't seen it. I can think of examples, and it's usually when public officials are praised or might even receive awards for their work in this area. Um, and or we have people who come along like Amanda who say, here are the things that we're doing, and an advocacy group like us, and would say, wow, that's really great. We appreciate that you're here. But no, I haven't seen that specifically when news media will come out and say, that somebody has gone above and beyond in following the law and in giving maybe more records than they had to provide openness. I really like that idea, the naming and faming. I wrote it down over here. I like that.
Yeah, well, meaning, and I wonder, Amanda, whether because to a large extent, part of it is also about metrics, right? And I like your FOI tracker, which is kind of a real way to also establish evidence, because the other thing in this space, as I always says, there's actually anyway, we always advocate for evidence-based policymaking as a result of some of the information sharing, but then are we evidence-based in FOI, in actually freedom of information, right? And so it seems to be like, anyway, how does the tracker work, and has it actually established more accountability, as you indicated? I would love to hear your experiences with that. And also, Colleen, any observations you might have on that point would be welcome. And then we go into some of the questions in the chat, and feel free to add to the chat as well.
Sure. So I have a prop here. This is our fiscal year 2020 annual report. I attended NFOIC's conference in Tennessee, and I spoke with our local coalition executive director, and I was asking her, how do you define transparency? Because I think folks on the government side define it one way, and folks, I'll say, on the outside define it another way. And how can we be more transparent? And one of the things she suggested, and you all suggested in some of the discussion at the conference, was to come out with metrics on FOIA. And that's what we've done. We implemented the tracker in 2017, and we're able to measure what the volume and impact is. And I think that's really allowed us to, make a more robust program. And it's also allowed us to show other localities outside of Fairfax County in Virginia what transparency might look like from someone else's perspective, and that providing annual reports is a good thing. And you don't need a sophisticated, super expensive tool to do that. You just need an Excel spreadsheet with a couple columns, and I think as a result of us implementing this report, you're starting to see other reports pop up in the Commonwealth too. So I think bridging those gaps between the government and folks like you all, and also hearing that feedback, which I've heard from Megan Ryan and the Virginia Coalition of Open Government, that an annual report's a good thing, does encourage us to do that, and makes it a priority for us to not only respond to FOIA requests, but create reports that demonstrate our commitment to transparency in showing the public what our FOIA impact is in Fairfax County. So I've definitely seen the benefits of the FOIA data and having that.
Great, thanks. And to you, Colleen, also it's perhaps not only metrics about the practice of FOIA, which I think is brilliant on what is happening there, but also the metrics on the value of open government. And I don't know whether you have any observations about that, and how you handle this in Connecticut, Colleen.
I think we really have to figure that out, because I think that the idea of metrics is really good to affect the culture of openness, but as Chip said, you have to have the leader at the top, whether it's the mayor, the governor, or you have to have somebody like Amanda. I think that's where we should start. Every county should have somebody like her with the same philosophy that she has. That would be wonderful, to have that philosophy. Instead of asking why should we grant access, ask why not? What's wrong with granting access? So I think you have to start with that premise that it starts from the top, and but I think we need to do a better job of getting that message out, the benefits side, As was said in another panel, you know, there's so much talk about body camera footage right now, obviously, but really get the message out that more often than not, and I don't know what the metrics are exactly, but I do have a sense of it, that more often than not, officers are, you know, their conduct exonerates them as opposed to, you know, shows that they conducted themselves in an inappropriate way. So that body camera footage is good. It's a good thing to release it. You know, things like budget information, getting that out there proactively, putting it up online means that your people don't have to answer FOI requests. Trying to make sure that public officials think practically. An example here in Connecticut, a reporter told me the other day that she wanted to know if she could file a complaint over this. Unfortunately, the answer is no, but she contacted our State Department of Education, and she was aware that there was a listserv that was going out to superintendents of schools in this COVID time, every week sending out messages that were not confidential. They were, you know, intended for public consumption, but she simply asked, can I be put on that listserv? Otherwise I'm gonna bug you every week or every day or whatever it is. And the answer ultimately came back, no, we can't do that. And I just think that that's really short-sighted, FOI-wise or otherwise, that getting that information out there without freedom of information requests or complaints is a really positive thing. Another thing that I think comes out today, perhaps we could kind of tell the media when somebody actually does something good, when you got access to information because somebody quickly, promptly gave you the information, give them a little check mark. That would probably be good, the idea of giving people positive feedback. Now, I don't know how much positive feedback there will be initially, but maybe we can build upon that. And, you know, one other thing I would say is that, you know, we tried to give an award through another organization that I was part of, and for good behavior, and we were sadly at a loss for a candidate. And that became the topic at the conference, that we had no candidate. So how we get out of that, I'm not really sure. One other thing that this same organization did is they tried during the election time to have people sign a Freedom of Information pledge, have the candidates sign a pledge. So that seemed like that was going to be a really, really good thing. Get people to sign the pledge, and a number of candidates for statewide office and in the legislature signed that pledge. But then what happens after that? Who comes after them when they violate the pledge? We open government advocates were kind of a small group, so the follow through on the people that didn't follow the pledge didn't happen, and I think there were a number of them that didn't follow it. But how do we change that? How do we get resources to follow up on those sorts of things?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Colleen. And it seems like this is what I guess the first question from Chris was after, which is that, at least as I understood it, is that everyone on the campaign trail is obviously pro freedom of information. I haven't heard that many candidates that were against. But then, of course, what happens when they are in government, right? And I think in our previous conversation, also, Colleen, what you mentioned also, which I thought was very valuable, is that in order to understand how to promote freedom of information, you actually also do need to understand how government works, because there's a difference between the ones outside of government and inside of government, because there are all kinds of constraints. And so can you tell us a little bit about what we should understand, that by just having that understanding, we would be able to anticipate better ways to actually promote compliance?
Right, I think, you know, starting a number of years ago, it was not in fashion to be somebody running for office who had worked in government for you know, the better part of their career. It was sort of a negative, this trend that you should come from the outside and you should have the private sector experience to run government like the private sector. It's kind of been pretty trendy. But I think in terms of open government, at least, that's a little bit dangerous, because you lose that continuity, and people who work in government really need to understand government. They need to understand the institutional history. They need to understand that it's not set up like private sector, nor should it be in most instances, or at least in some instances. So I think what's critical in any change in administration is that the new administration surrounds themselves, or at least has a few people who have that continuity, who carry forward philosophy. I think it would be great if each administration could have, again, somebody like Amanda's position there that doesn't change when the administration changes. So I think that that's something really critical to keep that continuity, have people in government who understand government and understand what the public wants to know about government.
Great. Chip, do you want to answer question 2 from Tom, which was referring to a variety of advice on transparency laws by lobbying associations, which then typically might not be anyway, might not be fans of the norms that they are advocating for. And so do you see that also in the dispute resolution space, based upon your research, that you have those tensions between the ones that are advocating for transparency as long as it doesn't apply to some of their own kind of
I think so. What's interesting here is, I think one of the ways you deal with that is by maintaining good communications between these groups and forums where you're talking about open records. I was very fortunate several years ago to be invited to talk to a Texas legislative study group. And at that group, we were considering what updates to the Texas Public Information Act might look like. And in that meeting, there were representatives from, the city and county attorneys groups, and from, law enforcement groups, and from the Attorney General's office, and from school associations. So the groups that are managing records on a lot of sides. And there's also a Texas Press Association, the FOIFT, so Freedom Information Foundation. So there are a number of advocates from different people. And in that room, we started to understand a lot of where people were coming from. So it was building those kinds of relationships between the leadership so they can understand. I think it's a place where groups, your state advocacy groups or NFOIC, if we can, show up at some of their meetings or have some discussions with them to try to be involved. So when they are doing these advice on transparency laws, that we're a part of that and can help inform that, I think that's helpful as well. One other thing I wanted to comment on is coming a bit off of both what Amanda and Colleen said, is in ways to make transparency easier rather than harder. I do think a lot of this comes into design and the way we design, the way we keep records, and how we disclose those. Right now, the system, and it always has been this way, is that not giving out the records is the easier thing to do, and giving out the records is a harder thing to do. You have to take an action to give out the records, and particularly in the old paper record keeping days. Well, now we have the technology that if everything's digital, it can be made available, and we could make the restriction of those records the hard part rather than the easy part. And the way I like to think about this is, imagine having, I talked to a legislative group about this, imagine having an email system where your government emails were, you had to designate them when you wrote them as being not subject to the open meetings law under the open records law under which exemption. And so when you sent that email, it was harder to make it close than it is to make it open. You send it open, it's open by default. To close it, you have to take the action in advance to say why you're closing it. And then otherwise, it just goes out onto a server, proactive transparency. So if you design documents so that they are open by design, and closing them is the harder thing, you have to take extra action to close them rather than extra action to make them open. Those are the sorts of actions, just by ease of design, that could make more things available. So, it's just building in the triggers so that transparency is the easier thing rather than the harder thing. And that can be done just through good tech design.
Great. And I'm sensitive to the time because, as you said, Chip, there's another panel that will present some amazing research papers after this. And so have for each of you a closing question, or the same closing question, with regard to what would be one priority area that you feel, if we would make progress there, it could be transformative for the next decade of freedom of information. So what would be the one recommendation if a legislator would ask you, what should we do, Chip? Or Amanda, how can we make your life easier? what would be the one priority area that you would suggest? Who wants to start? Amanda, you want to give a go here?
I will be sensitive to the time and not open my soapbox on this question.
Yeah, that's why I said one. Why I said, because I realized there might be many more.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that we could improve on is the old school way of looking at public records, files and in archives, redefining that as more public data and public information, and not just codifying that definition of public records, but through implementation and through how we're storing records, like you commented earlier. I think that's one of the biggest areas that I think we could improve on and would ultimately have the biggest impact.
Great. Colleen?
I think we ought to move forward with making freedom of information a state constitutional right.
Can you expand on that?
Well, there are a few states that do have that. Florida, I know. I just think that, if we talk about something has to come from the top, there is nothing closer to the top than our Constitution. So if it were enshrined in our Constitution, then at least that philosophical base would be there. And it's never been really seriously talked about in Connecticut, but if somebody asked me about it, I'd be happy to work on it.
Great. Chip?
So one would be kind of what I just talked about, building things around proactive transparency, thinking that if we were to throw out the open records law that exists now and start anew, what would it look like? And there's no way it would look like, well, you ask somebody for a document and they go and search for it and then they find it and give it to you. It would already exist. It'd be somewhere you can already find it on a website, because that's the way we keep records now, is electronically. So redesigning open records laws around the idea of proactive transparency through digital tech. I think that if we were to close our eyes and wake up and it was 2050, we'd already be there. So the question is, like, how do we get there over the next 30 years? What systems we have to do to change our old ways and get there. The last one I would recommend, though, is if your state does not have a FOIA-specific dispute resolution body, make one. So look at Connecticut, look at Pennsylvania, look at Illinois, look at some of the states that have already designed these and had a lot of success with them. And come up with something that is going to bring parties together, not just in resolving disputes, but in training and education and informing bills that go before the legislature. So have a FOIA-specific body if you don't already.
Great. But I do want to because we have one more minute. No, actually, we have one more minute left because they asked me to halt in 55. But I do want to say, with regard to the open data by default, I think that's obviously the pathway forward. But then, do we want to also complement that? And that's something what I think Amanda referred to with this notion of publish with purpose, right? So that you not just push everything out, but you also actually have a set of priority questions that you might want to especially advocate or especially accommodate. And I think having a clearer sense of what those questions might be might actually also probably be helpful. Anyway, a lot more to talk about, and I get all kinds of signals that I need to announce that another session is on its way. I do have to say, I think I was very much impressed with how this session was organized. So we came out of the dark into the open, and I think it was very symbolic that they actually limited at the beginning to really give a sense on what openness might feel like, even in a Zoom environment. Anyway, Colleen, Amanda, Chip, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. I learned a lot. Thanks to all the participants. And I think what remains is the transition to the next panel. Stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.